Reactive Training Systems.
As well. So our next presentation, or our next presenter rather, is Jim Elli. Jim is our youngest coach, and we make sure that he knows that all the time. But don't let Jim's age fool you. He's super devoted to his craft, and he's been doing this for quite a few years already, to be honest. One of the things that I like about Jim is that he's always seeking out new information and new ways of doing things and figuring out a way to put it into practice. It doesn't just stay theory with Jim. He finds a way to implement these ideas. And I would say probably his biggest skill as a coach is he's got what I would say is a pretty unique ability to connect with athletes and empathize with them and kind of feel what they're feeling. And that gives him a pretty unique perspective and allows him to provide some pretty on-the-point guidance as they go through, their own lifting journey. When you ask someone a question as it relates to training, a lot of the answers that you get are, well, that depends. And it's true, it depends, but it depends on what? Well, there are answers to these questions. There are ways to provide feedback. And what we see once you kind of dig into this a little bit more is it depends on some specifics about you and your preferences as an athlete. And a coach can provide like good actionable feedback on stuff like that, but a lot of times it depends on, the coach-athlete relationship. And I think kind of having a good way to empathize with athletes and connect with them personally probably gives Jim some unique insight on those types of matters. But anyway, so today Jim's going to be talking to you about nutritional practices, and I don't want to take any more of his time. So, hey everyone, here's Jim.
Hey guys. First of all, thank you for attending this seminar. This is an opportunity for me that personally I never thought would happen. But to be here in front of all you guys as a part of Team RTS has been probably one of the best experiences, and I'm just really happy to be here. It's a great day. Brooklyn and the city is awesome, so all you guys coming from Brooklyn and the surrounding area, awesome. If you're from further than that, then that's even cooler. It's really cool that you guys are coming. And Mike didn't mention this, but I've also been coaching the nutrition side of things for some of the lifters at RTS for about a year and a half. And prior to working with RTS, I had my own coaching company that I really liked, but I wanted more feedback. I wanted to work with other coaches, and the coaching staff on RTS is incredible. We've learned so much from each other, and I'm going to get started on this presentation. I'm going to be talking about practical nutritional applications for powerlifting. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this too is nutrition is the one thing that powerlifters I don't think talk a lot about. In bodybuilding, it's almost the primary focus. And powerlifting, it seems that a lot of the time, training is a big focus. And one of the reasons why I think nutrition really isn't talked about a lot is because, or it is talked about a lot, but it's not something I think a lot of powerlifters have a really good grasp on. And one of the main reasons is because there's a lot of misconceptions. And the main one I thought was funny is, people still say that creatine is a steroid. Depending on what gym you go to, you might hear things like that. Or, science doesn't know everything. This one especially, people like to think that science is like this we're always uncertain about things, we're always testing things. Technically we can't prove anything, but that doesn't mean that what we currently understand can't be applied to powerlifting and to ourselves and make us better lifters. Another thing is people say like carbs aren't needed for powerlifters. There's a certain powerlifter who I won't name, and he's really not a powerlifter, but more of an influence. He has like a war against carbohydrates, I've heard. And I think that's funny, and it's okay. It's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of uncertainties, and hopefully what I talk about today with you guys, you can take home with you and really apply, and you won't have a lot of those uncertainties. So who and what should we listen to? Well, primarily we should be listening to science and to researchers. As science evolves, we need to make sure we're staying up to date. But there's a lot of people, luckily for us in the field, not a lot, a few select people, I think, who I think we should be looking up to and taking this information and trying it out and seeing how it works for us. One of those guys is Eric Helms. He's a bodybuilder, powerlifter, someone who I've always looked up to, who probably the first guy I watched on YouTube about flexible dieting was Eric Helms. I think he had a video with Matt Ogus, who is one of the guys I looked up to growing up. I don't know why, he just was shredded. I thought it was a really cool person to look up to. And Eric Helms has been doing a lot of research, and just now recently, I think a few months ago, he just got his PhD. So congrats to you, Eric, if you're watching this. I've been looking up to you for a while, so good on you. Another guy who I really value is Alan Aragon. He's got a research review called Alan Aragon's Research Review. Really creative stuff there, Alan. But it's really good information, and he collabs with a lot of other scientists, and he puts a lot of this information in a way that we can all understand and hopefully apply to ourselves. So another great guy. And lastly, again, I said there's a few people. Lyle McDonald, probably one of the more pioneers in the nutritional research area. He's another guy who really takes all this information that seems very complicated and distills it down in a way that we can all learn from. And then after you figure out who to listen to, like, what do you listen to? And for the most part, even these researchers, they're looking at things that are really small. They're wanting to find the last remaining elements of ways we can progress. But only like 20% of the information that we listen to can actually make up about 80% of our results. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, is that the minimal information that makes a big difference versus the 5% of things or the 10% of things that are going to make a huge difference in our performance. As your competitiveness increases, that's when it's important to kind of stress the smaller stuff. But without the base, none of this really matters. Another few things, like the smaller stuff, supplements. They're really expensive, and people are investing hundreds of dollars into supplements that are making such a minor difference that maybe they should hire a coach. This isn't something for me, but maybe they should hire a coach to handle the bigger things that are going to make the bigger impact, the long-term impact. We have shiny object syndrome. We love to look at that one thing that might make us jacked in 2 weeks and build 18 pounds of muscle tomorrow. That's not going to happen, but it's really fun. It's really fun to do that. You know, I think it's like, is this beta-alanine supplement going to add 20 pounds to my squat? I don't know, maybe, probably not. Actually, it won't, but it's fun to think that way. And so there's a lot of issues, and on the next slide, I'll talk about the fundamentals. For most of the people here, I don't know where your knowledge is at. So you got to ask where to start. Without knowing more about all of you, it's really difficult to know where to start. But for most people, doing some sort of knowledge assessment will be really helpful. If you're asking things like, what's a macronutrient? It's a fine question to ask, but that kind of implies that you might not know a lot about nutrition, just because macronutrients are what makes up everything that we eat for the most part. The 80% of things to focus on probably are the macronutrients, the smaller stuff, the micronutrients. Just for those who are unaware, macronutrients would be your protein, carbohydrates, fats, and actually technically alcohol is considered a macronutrient. But more importantly, you want to start slow with all of this. So the first step for everyone, if you haven't done this, is to download a calorie tracking application. The reason I recommend this is if you're just kind of guessing and applying some of this stuff and just saying, I eat well, most of my diet is probably pretty good, you don't really know. And calorie tracking apps will minimize any questions you might have about your own diet. Things like MyFitnessPal and MyMacros Plus are really good. The only issue is a lot of them, they're user generated, so you got to kind of use your head a little bit about, you know, if you have some chicken and it says it's 1,000 calories for 4 ounces, it's probably not, you know, reliable. Get a food scale. That's going to make all of this even more helpful for you because it's even more accurate. And in the beginning, accuracy is really important because we need to have a good base, know what we're used to, so we can make adjustments from there. So what I recommend is for 2 weeks, track everything. Everything you're eating, I want you to track it, put it on a food scale, whatever you consume, eating, drinking. A lot of people forget about the oils that they put on their frying pans and stuff. Track that if you can. Eat as normal. We don't want to overcompensate. Let's say you're trying to make a change and you overcompensate. we won't have a good estimate of maybe your average intake. It's going to be more whatever you're trying to do. If you're trying to bulk, maybe you'll eat more just because you want to say, look, my maintenance level is 4,000 calories. I think I should start with 5. On the contrary, if you're trying to lose weight, we want it to be as accurate as possible. And if you skip that step, jump starting really is going to make it the long run results a little bit more or less bad, less stability in the long run. Create the habit first, and we can move on from there. So before we get into some of the specifics, we're going to talk about nutritional goal setting. And questions to ask yourself are, what will make you a better powerlifter? And you got to ask this for yourself in the short term and in the long term. So short term, cutting to a lower weight class might be really beneficial. Your Wilks score might temporarily increase. But in the long term, how long can you sustain that increase in Wilks? In the long term, will staying in a lower weight class really be that beneficial for you? Or do you need to take a longer term approach with a bulk and just really see how that progression unfolds? And how competitive are you currently? If you're very competitive, then a lot of the information I have moving forward is just to enhance what you're already doing. If you're not that competitive, you need to ask yourself two or three questions. The one is like, are you carrying too much fat? Now, having too much fat is no big deal, but if you're trying to maximize your competition, cutting fat is like a really easy way to increase your competitiveness. Similarly, if you are too skinny, well, gain some weight. If you're not competitive, let's bulk. Let's put some muscle on you. It's going to be really helpful. The other thing is the increased competition in the USAPL. Two years ago, even, if you had like a 450 Wilks, you might be going to Worlds. Now, people in the 63 weight class, like women's weight class, are scoring like 517, and they're not even getting invited to the world team. Like, that's insane. So this needs to be a very personal decision. If you're trying to cut a weight class because you're thinking, I'm not very competitive in mine. If I drop down or bulk up, I'll be on the world team. Like, that might not be as realistic as it used to be 2 or 3 years ago. So these two questions need to be incredibly personal, because we're not getting paid. This isn't a professional sport. What makes you feel better, and also what's going to make you better right now and in the long term? The other thing you need to consider too is, what is your current health status? Because people are always talking about performance, but again, we're not getting paid. Some of us are getting paid maybe like $500 for a meet, but that's not paying your bills. That's not going to allow you to live for like 30 years, So considering your health status is really important. If you go to the doctor and got a blood test, would they be concerned? Now, this is also more a part of your moral and how you feel about yourself. It's not my decision to decide what proper health is. It's what are you comfortable with, and what makes you feel good. And psychologically, maybe cutting isn't a good idea. Maybe you have some issues with food. Maybe you have some eating disorders. That needs to be addressed before we jump into what's the best for me as a powerlifter. Well, the best for you as a powerlifter in that condition is to address the psychological things first before even getting crazy with all of this. Because once you create the habit, if you're creating it from a place of mental instability, and I'm not saying everyone that has that type of issue is mentally unstable or anything, but you need to be pretty level-headed about these decisions and make sure that in the long run, this is the right choice. Personal preferences also really matter. Again, if you want to feel good, this should be something kind of enjoyable in the long run. So don't think about it too much, but what makes you feel good, what makes you a better powerlifter, and how competitive are you currently? But overall, your health matters. We can't be forgetting about that. So let's make the assumption that you've decided that the best thing for you to do is cutting. And I'm talking a lot about cutting in this presentation because I think it's one of the most complicated decisions. Doing this properly is really important. What matters when cutting is maintaining your strength and hopefully gaining strength. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that you can, in fact, gain strength while cutting. Most of people I work with have or do gain strength while they cut. If they're not, it's like they get mad at me. You know, what are you doing, man? We're losing too much weight. I don't like that to happen. So my main priority is to at least maintain their strength. But more often than not, they do gain strength as long as we're doing this right. What also matters for you as a powerlifter is increasing your Wilks score. If you think the best thing for you as a powerlifter is to cut and your Wilks score is decreasing, then likely you've made the wrong decision. But this isn't always immediate. Sometimes you'll lose some weight and your Wilks will drop, and then maybe in 5 months, all of a sudden you've adapted to that lower weight and you're ready, and it makes sense for you. But this is where the mindset really comes in. It kind of ties into the psychological stuff you need to make sure you're addressing. Is if you don't buy into your decision and you think cutting is negative and you're going to have a bad time cutting, and everyone you know who's lost weight has also maybe lost some strength on their bench or their squat, and you think that's going to happen to you, that might, as Ross was kind of talking about, if you think that, it will probably happen over time. So you need to buy in and believe that you'll be okay. There's a lot of proof, I guess, that it's happened. Many people have cut and gotten stronger. And for cutting, I think that's really important, is making sure you believe it, that it'll work for you and that you'll gain strength. The long-term approach is really up to you. 20 to 35 weeks is more or less an average of how long most people will want to cut. But if you're really thinking long term, it really depends where you're starting from. So this could be 5 weeks, 10 weeks, 2 weeks. It really depends on the individual. And as I mentioned before, we tend to miss the forest for the trees. We focus on these little things that are making minimal difference. Like one day you're in a surplus, you decide to cut, one day you're in a surplus, oh no, my whole diet is ruined. All the 150 days that I was doing really well, I was in a 200 calorie surplus today, I should just stop. Powerlifting, this is no longer worth it. Needs to end now. And so you need to make sure you're not sweating the small stuff. It doesn't matter. The averages, in general, the law of averages is that it'll all work itself out in the end. That's not the law of averages entirely, but that's the point. Again, perfection isn't the goal. If we were perfect and our standard was based on perfection, we would all be failures. And that's something that I think a lot of people have a tough time, because they attach their ego to their performance and being perfect. And especially with like social media, it becomes very easy to think everyone's perfect all the time. No one has problems. You know, you never see anyone's problems on the internet, because if they're really public about them, one, I think that's pretty awesome. If you're public about your issues, then you're real. But a lot of people aren't willing to do that on social media. So it's easy to think that everyone's perfect and that if you have any problems in your life, that you're a failure. And it shouldn't be thought that way. Focus on the weekly average, focus on the monthly average, just focus kind of more or less on the averages. And without tracking all of this, you won't be able to. Before we get into the calories, we need to talk about proper rate of weight loss. That's hard for me to say. Beginners and people with higher body fat percentages can typically lose a bit quicker without having any detriment in their strength. The thing with beginners is almost any training stimulus you throw at them, they're going to respond to. That's similar to muscle mass and growth and strength. They're going to respond well in almost all aspects. So having a controlled cut isn't going to impact that much. And so they can lose faster without any detriment. People with higher body fat percentages aren't going to really dig into their muscle tissue until a lot of that body fat is actually reduced. It's really taxing to carry body fat, but if we are setting up the diet properly, we shouldn't be worried too much about losing muscle mass. It's not going to happen, especially if your training and all of the other stuff is in place. Advanced lifters lose a little bit slower, about 0.5 to 0.75% of your body weight per week. This is more or less an average, so it's not just 1 pound for everyone. If you're 52 kilos and you're losing a pound a week, that's going to be really, really fast. So this is percentage based, so it makes it a little bit easier. Again, you need to be tracking how are you responding. None of this matters if you're not tracking how you're responding. If you decide that cutting is a good idea for you, but you don't even know if your Wilks score is improving, if your strength's improving, are you recovering well, then nothing matters. We have a tool called Track that Mike mentioned if you haven't used it, where it basically tracks your recovery day to day. And I like to use this for my clients when they're especially as they're coming up on meets. If they're cutting, I want to know how they're recovering, because what you can do is either you can adjust slightly to the training, and if that can't do everything, you can throw in some refeeds, which we'll talk about. You can add some things to make the cut less miserable. And ideally, the cutting isn't miserable at all. That's kind of the point. So where do we start with the calories? As I mentioned, I wanted you to track all your food intake for about 2 weeks. This should give us a metabolic maintenance, so to speak. The maintenance calories are going to change every day depending on how your life is, but that's why the averages are really cool, because it doesn't really matter if everything changes on one day, it'll all average out in the end. For the most part, start with 500 calories less than the calculated out average. Most people are maintaining throughout the weeks. If this isn't enough to get the body weight to drop, that's when we can take about 200 calories from the calculated average, but 500 calories should be a good place to start. The other thing is, calories are the number one priority. Without hitting the calorie target, you're not going to be hitting any weight loss goals. You can mess up in every other aspect if you absolutely have to, or something isn't working. If you're not in the right place to perfectly find 127 grams of protein. If you can get your calories right, that shouldn't matter too much. Perfection isn't the goal. I'm going to talk about it a lot. Auto-regulate based on the strength goal rate of weight loss. If you're not losing at the proper weight rate, then you need to adjust the calories, because if you're moving too quickly, that could actually lead to detriment, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So making sure you're paying attention to what's happening on a week-to-week basis is really important. And I recommend reevaluating your caloric goal about every week or two. 2 weeks is probably better for most people. I do it weekly for my clients, but it depends on how much time you have and how meticulous you want to be and how important the cut matters to you. Micronutrients, I'm going to talk just about it right now. Just make sure you're eating fruits and vegetables. Make sure that's in your diet. If you're eating about 2 to 3 servings of fruits and vegetables and not getting the micronutrients that you need, it's probably because you're only eating apples. Get a variety. Get a variety of foods in your body, and you should be good. Fiber should be okay for most people. Now, if you're really cutting with a very low amount of calories, maybe you can supplement with fiber, supplement with some multivitamins, that's fine. Maybe you just hate fruits, you don't really want to have them, and you don't have a lot of food to eat anyway. But the benefit of fruit is that it fills you up, so you might hate them, but you're going to feel a little bit better and hopefully less hungry. That's all I want to talk about with micronutrients. It's not really the main focus on this presentation. My general guideline for macronutrients, I think this is the topic that everyone wants to know about, is how much, first of all, protein. It's the mecca of macronutrients. Everyone wants to know what the optimal rate of protein is, because they really want to make sure they're maximizing their strength and their muscle. Back in a few years ago, people were eating 2 times, 3 times their body weight in protein. I don't think that really matters. It's not going to make a difference. I think unless you really like how chicken tastes, I think personally I like carbs. I like sugar, and so I kind of like my protein lower. And this is another personal preference type thing. But if you're talking about optimizing muscle mass and taking advantage of muscle protein synthesis near your training and day to day, eating about 0.7 to 1.2 grams per pound of body weight should be enough for most people. And that's just talking about performance. The other things you need to consider are recovery and satiation. Satiation is essentially how full you feel after eating food. And I think this is a really important thing, and on why, while you're cutting, it's important to kind of push that percentage up a little bit. No one wants to feel like they're dieting when they're dieting. If you feel like you're dieting, I don't feel good. I feel like I just want a cake. And if you can make yourself feel like you're eating cake all the time, you can make protein versions of cake. Don't do it. It's not that good. The other thing is, if you really just focus on muscle protein synthesis, is getting about 20 to 30 grams per meal and have about 4 to 5 meals per day spaced out, potentially you're optimizing any muscle protein synthesis, i.e. muscle growth, that you can possibly get in one day. So that's something to think about, but that's more on the 80% of things people really hyper-focus on. That's only gonna make 10, 20% of the difference, but in reality, probably 5%, if I'm being honest. The next macronutrient is fat. And the purposes that we're gonna talk about fat and for this lecture is they kind of regulate hormones and allow for hormone production. So which is important, obviously, as powerlifters, but we don't need as much as some people think we need. And we can go pretty low without having any detriment to our hormone production. But in general, as we cut, we're gonna have some down regulation in our hormones. So understanding that and remembering that your net weight and how much muscle mass you actually have and how much fat you have on your body is more important than the dietary fat you're eating. At the same time, you wanna make sure you're eating fat just to regulate your hormone production. I recommend about 15% to 25% of your calories. When cutting, if you have a lot of high fat foods, it's gonna be really easy to fill up your calories, and you'll be done by afternoon if you eat like me. I don't recommend it too much. I don't recommend eating too much fat because I like protein, I like carbs. I don't wanna fill up my food and my calorie intake by midday. Lower end means more carbs, but personal preference matters. If you can find a way to put a lot of fat in your diet because you really like how high fat foods taste, then you can definitely do that. What about carbs? The other really fun macronutrient that everyone on Instagram just loves to brag about how many carbs they're eating every day. I would brag about it too, but I'm not cutting, so I get to eat as many as I want. But their purpose for powerlifting is they refill glycogen stores and they allow for a little bit more recovery and they allow you to endure longer workouts. If you're in a developmental phase, likely after every training session, you're gonna have some glycogen depletion. And when you're already cutting and you're in a deficit, you're not gonna be able to endure the workouts as long if your glycogen stores are low. And so if you have a low carb diet, you're gonna feel worse overall every day. And so having some higher carbs should help with day-to-day activities. And that's something I don't think a lot of people talk about either, is not all of us are just powerlifters. A lot of us have jobs, we have other things and other priorities we need to do and we need energy for. So sure, maybe low carb would be really good for powerlifting, but there's other things in your life and you can't neglect powerlifting, or you can't neglect everything else for powerlifting. It's not, in my opinion, not responsible, but that's not my decision to make. It's just something I think is important to talk about. The other thing is carbohydrates hydrate muscle cells. Potentially, the more hydrated your muscle cells are, the more anabolic they are, i.e. they're going to respond better to the peaks in muscle protein synthesis post-workout and as you increase your protein intake, which potentially would lead to more strength. There's more data that needs to be analyzed to kind of have a exact mechanism to explain that, but that's something you should recognize yourself with. Fiber, again, kind of the 80-20 rule. If you fill about 80% of your diet with high quality foods, micronutrient dense foods, then likely you're gonna get enough fiber. And I don't like to talk about it too much. It's really a non-issue for most people, but make sure you're getting it in. And if you're tracking it and you notice you're sub 10 grams every day, sub 15, you should probably increase the vegetables and fruit that you're eating. But how many carbohydrates can we eat? What you're gonna do is subtract your calories from the total protein and fat calories. So 1 gram of protein is 4 calories and 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. So I'm not gonna do the math for you, everyone's gonna be different. Just total up the calories you're eating from protein and fat, subtract that. The difference will be in calories from carbs. Then you'll divide the carbohydrates by 4 grams, and that'll be the total grams per day. Again, personal preference, like all things, matters really here. But the really cool thing with carbohydrates is that they make refeeds really fun, because if you're in a deficit, you're gonna have low carbs. At some point, the carbs are just not gonna be where you want them. You won't have your, I don't know, whatever you prefer. I really like Sour Patch Kids, like all the time. I had 2 bags today already. So, you know, the refeeds are really fun when you're cutting. You get to have all those goodies that you don't get to have throughout the rest of the week, because, you know, you'll have a limited amount of calories in it. You need to be considerate to yourself. So refeeds are basically days within the week where you bring up your maintenance level, bring your calories up to maintenance level. I like to just do this by just adding carbs. Just throw all the carbs you can to bring up your caloric intake to maintenance, and you'll have that for the day. In a deficit, I typically recommend these either before or definitely before training, but you can do it on the day of training. Just get a lot of carbs before you train or the day before. It's personal preference too, because when you're really in a long-term diet, you want to do what makes dieting more sustainable. So if you think about the refeed as like a cheat day, it's probably not, you shouldn't think about it like a cheat day. You need to make sure you're still calculated, you just are eating more carbs. It shouldn't be like, okay, it's a refeed, I can eat everything. No, you can't. It's going to be maintenance. It's just going to feel a little bit better than your normal deficit days. And then diet breaks are something I like to implement about 4 to 5 weeks. These are going to have more of a physiological benefit, other than, like, refeeds are mostly psychological, make you feel better. Diet breaks, you're going to bring your calories up to maintenance level for about a week or 2. If you're lucky, if I like you, if you're being nice to me, you get to have 2 weeks of a diet break. A lot of times what you'll see though is you'll actually lose weight during these diet breaks. And sometimes it's because you have more energy because you've just had a week of maintenance calories. Now you can go do a lot more things. You can go play with your friends. But it allows you to have more energy for everything else. You're not sitting down as much. You just have more energy, and so your net energy output increases, which potentially leads to more weight loss, which is great. You just ate maintenance for 2 weeks and you're losing weight. That tends to even itself out though, which is why we go back into the cut. That's kind of covers most of the cutting. And I wish I had more to talk about and could get more in detail with every individual, but the point you gotta have to think about is what matters for you. But for the short term, we're gonna talk about making weight, and I think this is really applicable to most powerlifters, because who wants to cut really? I mean, no one wants to. It's like, it needs to be a personal decision. I do advocate for it for most people when it makes sense. But sometimes it doesn't make sense. Maybe you are really competitive and the only time you need to cut is 1 to 2 weeks before the competition. Maybe you're only a few pounds heavy. You don't need to lower your weight if you can 3 to 4 pounds from water loading. But these strategies are something that I use with a lot of my lifters and something that's really important to understand. And this is probably the most personal for everyone, because you need to feel confident on the platform. If you're throwing new ideas at yourself every time you compete and you're just like, let's try this and this and this, it's going to be difficult to feel confident on the platform. So when you're implementing these ideas, make sure you're doing it at less important meets, and then you can be confident at big meets. The first thing I'll talk about is water loading. It's probably the simplest way to lose a good amount of weight. 3 to 4 pounds is what I typically see. Some people carry a lot more water and they'll lose more just from the water load, and some people lose less, which sucks for them because then they have to take out the carbs, which apparently nobody wants to do. 4 to 5 days out, we're gonna double your water intake, but you don't know how much water you normally consume, so about 2 weeks out, I start tracking fluid intake. Just figure out how much fluid you're intaking and then double that about 4 to 5 days out. It's really simple. Just maintain that level. That you double it once, maintain that level for 4 to 5 days, and then cut it about 14 hours out. This 14 hours out can increase or decrease depending on how comfortable you are with the idea and how much weight you really need to lose. The other way to do this is food manipulation. What you'll do is replace your carbs with fat. And this accomplishes 2 things. 1, carbohydrates store water. 1 gram of carbohydrate stores about 3 grams of water. So by reducing your carbs, you're going to lower the water that's you're holding on to. And then because you're replacing the carbohydrate foods with fats, typically foods with higher fat are going to weigh less. Like chips, Oreos, peanuts, peanut butter, almonds, stuff like that. Hopefully you can eat almonds and don't have an allergic reaction. But if you can do that, those are like the easiest things. I mean, you can have 3 handfuls of almonds and it's like 2,000 calories or something. So you can get a lot of food without feeling heavy. And that's really important 2 to 3 days out, because the amount of food you're carrying in your body is what's going to show up on the scale. So if you can reduce the amount of food and the weight of the food that you're eating, the scale is going to show up at a lower number, which is great. And those 2 things are what I try to stick to. Then if we have to, we can start sweating, which is something I just would rather not do because it can really tax people. And you're doing it usually like the night of your competition, and that can be really stressful psychologically. And I want you to be feeling as good as you can when you're on the platform. There's two ways you can kind of induce sweat. You can do it from exercise. Actually, I had a lifter at Nationals who I wish we didn't have to do this with, but the protocol didn't go as planned, and we had to just, I said, put a sweatshirt on, walk around the airport for like 30 minutes, and while you're doing that, spit into a cup. And so we're really trying to maximize the way we could lose because we put all this work in, and this is something you can do, and that's why these are all tools. Hopefully you don't have to go to this bottom one, but it's what we did, and she made weight. Exercise-induced sweating seems to have a less of an impact on performance. I don't know why. This is more psychological. She seemed to have no impact on it. You can also do heat-induced sweating, i.e. go in a sauna, sit there, come out, weigh yourself until you're at the weight you need to be. There's more in-depth information we could learn about this. I just don't like doing it, so that's kind of a last resort thing. The most important thing after all of this is rehydration. If you're not rehydrated, then you are going to see a detriment. It's almost guaranteed. So get your body weight about 1.5 times more than what you lost. This is more or less a generalized rule of thumb. At least make weight. Be where you were when you started the cut. One really good way to do this is right after you step on the scale, have about 800 milliliters of fluid with some carbohydrates. So that's Powerade, Gatorade, Pedialyte, but have a lot of fluid. It speeds up the water retention and allows you to gain weight pretty quick. Keep drinking water throughout the 2 hours that you have after weighing in. This is just the initial protocol, and then you just want to kind of monitor your body weight until you're where you need to be. But if you can have about 800 milliliters of fluid right away, you should be on a good path to gaining back all of that weight. So let's decide that bulking is the most important, and bulking is really not that complicated. But a lot of people get this wrong when they make this decision, in that they just make it a free-for-all. Bulking isn't a free-for-all either. If you're a serious athlete, you need to be taking your bulk seriously. It's not just, okay, every weekend I'm doing whatever I want. Like, keep track of things even when it's more fun, but don't take advantage of it. Just track your bulk. It's similar to cutting, but it's less strict. You don't need to have refeeds or diet breaks. Typically, psychologically, you're not hating yourself every other day. And ideally, I keep saying that, but ideally during your cut, you really do enjoy it. Like, that's the point with all of what I just talked about. Hopefully you're enjoying the cut. But during the bulk, you really should really enjoy it, but don't take advantage of it, because if you don't do this right, in 3 years, you're gonna have 15 pounds of extra fat that isn't attributing to a better Wilks score. So in the long term, beginners can and should gain weight pretty quickly. You can gain about 1 to 2 pounds a month, maybe more, because you're going to be in such a better position to be anabolic and gain muscle and gain strength, that minimizing how much weight you gain because you're trying to minimize fat, it's not the best idea. Your P ratio, which is essentially how much protein, how much muscle you'll build per pound of body weight, is higher as a beginner because you're in such a better position to respond. Advanced lifters should bulk a little bit slower, and it should probably take them 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. If you're thinking about going from one weight class to another and you're doing this right, you're only going to want to gain about 12 pounds a year. And so you might not that might not break the gap or bridge the gap just yet. So it might take you a while to get to the weight class where you're going to be comfortable and competitive, hopefully, and making you a better powerlifter. So don't jump into the next weight class. It might be exciting to think, yeah, from going from 63 to 73, it'll be easy, but that's like 72, sorry. It's about 22 pounds or something like that. So it's a lot of weight you're gaining, and if you're doing it improperly, you're not going to see the Wilks score improvements that we're looking for. Keep track of your estimated warm-up max throughout all of this, whether you're bulking or cutting. If this isn't improving, then you need to readjust your strategy. I'm really not talking about bulking a lot. It's really simple. Everything else is basically the same. You're just going to tailor it to more personal preferences because you have a lot more freedom and you don't need to be as strict. More advanced nutrition, maintaining body weight. So highly competitive lifters, they typically don't need to bulk or cut because they're really competitive in their weight class. So They don't need to do anything too crazy or long term. They just need to make sure that their bases are covered. If you're highly competitive, a really easy way to improve your response to training may be to just make sure you're getting enough protein, tracking your intake. Like, if you're not doing that, that's something that a lot of other lifters might be doing that you're not taking advantage of. It's also really important as a highly competitive lifter to dial in your weight cutting protocol. I know a lifter I worked with, Jason Liu, he's he's on this other slide, deadlifting. He's a 59 kilogram lifter. He knows what works for him. We actually did a small meet. We practiced some different weight cut protocols. He didn't like them, so we stuck with what works. And he had a good performance at Worlds. It was disappointing, but overall he had PRs pretty much across the board. So that's really important. And stressing the small stuff does matter as you get a little bit more competitive. If there's 2% of a performance benefit, I mean, at these higher levels, the difference between the first place and second place could be 2.5 kilos. And there might be 5 people that tied you. Like, it's incredibly competitive. So yeah, the small stuff starts to matter. The supplements you take might start to matter. The meal timing might start to matter. So in regards to meal timing, these are kind of a few things that I really like. Consume about 25% of your protein circa training. So 3 to 4 hours before, 3 to 4 hours after, maybe even 2 to 3 before and after, you should have a meal consisting of about 20 grams of protein. This is going to peak your muscle protein synthesis. I keep saying that it's just muscle growth. And you're going to make sure that you're optimizing the window. It's a wide window. It's not a 20-minute, 30-minute window. But there is a time where you might be hypersensitive to putting on a little bit more muscle. So if you consume about 25% of that protein, of your daily protein in that 2 to 3 hours before training, 2 to 3 hours after training, you should maximize that and not have any issues. The other thing is how you're feeling during training becomes incredibly important. If you have a bunch of training sessions in a row because you don't feel good because you didn't eat enough, that's going to add up over time. And so we want as many training sessions in a row or over time on average to feel good, so we're maximizing our performance and we're really just growing every single time instead of having a bunch of bad workouts because you don't feel good, you didn't eat any food. So personal preference is like super important here. What makes you feel good? What's going to lead to more positive performance on the platform? I talked about this before, 4 to 5 meals a day with about 20 to 30 grams of protein. This is more or less, this is like really small difference, but if you're highly competitive, I'd try to do this if you can. And meal planning is going to be kind of cool here too. You don't have to think too much about when your meals are coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about supplements. Creatine, the only supplement that I think is super important that actually has a positive impact. If you're not taking creatine as a highly competitive lifter, you're likely missing out. There is all the data in the world indicating its benefit, though you could be a non-responder in that case, just do everything else. But if you happen to respond to this, it's the one supplement that there is data on that you should be able to improve on and improve from. Caffeine's cool too. Personally, I really like a lot of caffeine meet day. There is some performance benefit to that. That's again, personal preference. Try that out in training, try that out in smaller meets. Figure out what works for you. Yeah, there's probably a lot more we could talk about in terms of advanced nutrition, but like this is what matters. All the other smaller stuff, it's even less of an importance, but this is what I've experienced really matters. And if you can dial all of this in, you should have a really positive return on investment. So the takeaways here, I know I talked about a lot, but the most important things to focus on are building the habit first. Without a solid foundation, doing everything else, it doesn't matter. Something's gonna break. You need to be secure mentally, your health needs to be good, you need to be ready for the demands of training. And if you don't have the habit, then as stress increases, a lot of the stuff that you didn't take that much time to develop is gonna break. Also, focus on longevity. If you're not thinking long-term, you should think short-term too, but think, how is this short-term gonna apply to the long-term? Every day you're doing something, how is this applying to my long-term plan as a better powerlifter? And you need to be always wondering what makes you a better powerlifter, if that's your priority, to be better as a powerlifter, and hopefully it is. If you're not thinking about this almost every day, you may have a bunch of days in a row where, yeah, maybe drinking last night all night for 7 hours wasn't a good idea, but have fun with your life at the same time. Like, yes, you need to be able to work those days in where you have a lot of fun. But if it's the small stuff starts to matter as your competitiveness increases. So you might find a lot of high-level powerlifters, they don't drink. I mean, maybe some of them do, but alcohol might have a negative impact. That's just one example. I'm not trying to make this a moral debate. But what makes you better? What makes me better is different from what makes you better. But at the same time, the base of all of this is going to help pretty much everyone. So consistency is more important than perfection. The averages are really going to make the difference. Don't stress about being perfect. Nobody's perfect. Miley Cyrus, I think, said it first. So this is really the overview. This is the takeaway. I don't have much else to say, but honestly, thanks all of you for coming out. It's the last presentation of the day. Hope it was a good follow-up to Ross's and Mike's, and I'll take it from there, yeah. Oh, yeah, we got questions.
Hey, so I'm going up in weight class, and I have a meet in a couple weeks, but I'm not all the way at the top of the weight class. What do you recommend for like the week of, and like after weighing in? Like there's all this stuff if you're cutting, but what do you recommend for like pre-meet and for someone who has room to spare?
Yeah, so that's like really kind of a good question, because it's very similar. Like a lot of this is similar in structure, but how you feel about it is different. If you're cutting, you're like probably really excited about the meet day because finally you get to kind of binge. As bulking, you can still binge and it won't make a difference. So just make sure you feel good, make sure you're hydrated, make sure the food you're eating is food that you're comfortable with, because a lot of times when people are eating like meet day foods, they're like, finally I can have Oreos, but they never have Oreos through training, and then it makes their stomach hurt. So that's something I deal with, and I'll like convince myself I can have chocolate, but like I'm lactose intolerant. So then meet day, it's like the worst thing in the world, So be smart with it, be smart with the nutritional decisions, but yeah, go hard on the eating. Like, like I don't have any, because it's one day, like you might as well feel good, make sure everything's maxed out. Protein wise too, I always recommend to have like, 20 grams of protein or something. It's not super important, but since you're bulking, like you probably have protein anyway, so get that in. Something I didn't really talk about a lot is I really like caffeine, but I'm like more extroverted. So like I'll have a gram of caffeine, and I know a lot of people will just have a crap load of caffeine. I'll have 200, 300 grams of protein of caffeine before squatting, maybe before benching, but definitely before deadlifting. Like so I like to maximize that there. And then yeah, exactly. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, she needs it.
Types of creatine, do you think it matters?
No, I think there's some creatine that is out there that may have like less impact on your stomach. But I think a lot of the stomach issues that people run into are because they're super dosing. So like in order for creatine to work, creatine needs to be saturated within your muscle cells. So one way to speed that up is to have 20 grams every day for like 1 week or something. I don't recommend that because it bothers my stomach. So just have 5 grams a day for the whole month, and by the end of the month it'll kick in. You won't really notice it immediately, but it's working. And monohydrate is the one that's been studied and researched. So everything else, it's like, why risk it? Yeah. Anything else?
Hey, so I just had a couple questions about things they might do to lose a few pounds before meet day. So I just wanted to specifically like the performance impact of, you think, the water manipulation, performance impact of cutting carbohydrates, when you would cut the carbohydrates, and also you didn't mention anything about sodium.
Yeah.
I was just curious about if you want to touch on that.
Good point. First of all, I didn't talk about sodium because I personally just want to avoid that as much as possible. I find that to be potentially the most risky, and like, how much really are you losing? I don't know, because I really don't like to implement that with anyone. I have certain clients where it's like they have actual health issues that we need to consider, and if I'm starting to manipulate sodium, that might honestly like be the difference maker between if they freaking live. Not actually, but like it's more of a stress. I don't I don't want to have that on me. And it just isn't needed usually. If we're implementing everything else, sodium manipulation for the most part is just so risky that like I'd rather not. I've had friends that went into rhabdo because they did everything. They're like, I have 30 pounds to lose, and then they're in the hospital the next day. Like, it's serious. Like, you can't just, oh, how do I lose all the water? Like, if you lost all the water in your body, you know, you die, obviously. So, like, you don't need to go crazy. And if we're implementing the rest of the stuff, like I said, you don't need to. The other thing, what were the other two parts on top of sodium? Yeah. So, when to do that? Yeah. A week out, I try to probably replace carbs with fat. Also, I try to see how they're responding to the initial water loading period, because a lot of times when you initiate the water loading, I'll actually see people losing weight. And if they start losing weight off the get-go, it's because they start, they actually respond early kind of to the water load. If they're losing weight and if in the past they've lost 3-4 pounds from the water load, I'll see where the weight is midweek. And if it's where it needs to be, because they always lose 3 pounds at the 14-hour marker on the platform, I won't manipulate food or carbohydrates at all because they don't need it. The other thing is I keep the calories the same. So if I am going to replace carbohydrates with fat, I'll keep the calories the same. And if I do that, it's because I know, first of all, if they have more than 4 pounds to lose, that's going to happen. We're going to be doing a carb food manipulation. If they don't have more than 4 pounds to lose, then it's kind of like, you just need to know the lifter and like how to do it. If they have a lot to lose, then almost all of the carbs are going to be replaced with fats. If they don't have a lot to lose, then maybe half. Again, it's a lot, like, it depends on the lifter, how they respond. But you can do a lot with it. There's a lot of fluctuation with how I do that. Does that answer it?
Reactive training systems.